I think the national interest remained static for the longest time. It was very much built on South Africa would be looking at the world and looking at Africa in particular as a pivot in its national interest. Now, when I said South Africa was the darling of the international system, I also have to qualify that and say in Africa, there were mixed reactions to South Africa's re-emergence on the international arena. For example, in Southern Africa, during the time of Robert Mugabe, when he was president, there were tensions in terms of whether South Africa represented the voice and agency of Africa, or whether South Africa was more about its own interest. And that becomes a serious dilemma in our foreign policy, because we want to defend the fact that everything we do in our foreign policy from a government perspective is in the interest of Africa. And that becomes complicated and complex, because your national interest cannot be the national interest of the continent. Yes, you're doing it in the sense of development. I mean, I think Mbeki made a very interesting point when he spoke about the African Renaissance and the African dream. He talked about the transformation of Africa from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. He talked about the African Renaissance, rebuilding. He talked about the fact that South Africa, and this is a very, very interesting quote he made, South Africa cannot be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. And he was talking about how the world saw us. And to be honest, at the time, 94, and I think up to the time when President Mbeki resigned in 2008, South Africa was doing really well economically. It was very, very important that was our highest level of growth. I think we touched around 5% at the time under Mbeki. In terms of our investments in the continent, in Southern Africa and in Africa, our South African corporates were profiled, visible. They were the biggest investors in terms of construction, railway, electricity, water, tourism, the hospitality industry, the retail and supermarket industry. So it was very interesting that the reaction to South African investment or corporate expansion, both state-led and private sector-led, was also a negative reaction to the fact that there was a hesitancy about South Africa's ambitions in the continent, whether the government's relationship with the continent, based on the idea that we don't want to be a hegemon or we don't want to be a preponderant power in Africa and dominate Africa, that we want to see everything through partnership and cooperation, wasn't always believed by other African states. Sure. Or leaders of other African states, and including their citizens. And I think that's coming home to roost now, because South Africa also became an important migration center for people coming out of the continent, coming to South Africa as economic migrants or refugees, because that was the other thing we did. We complied with the international protocol and the UN protocols and frameworks on refugee status and so forth. And now that's coming home to roost for us, because we're having a reaction to foreigners in our country, especially at the bottom end of the economic scale, where there's competition and tension over scarce resources for jobs. And especially where there's this perception that foreigners are coming in and taking our jobs. And you have political parties like the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, who utilize that kind of xenophobic approach and use that as the basis to define what their election domestic strategies are. Similarly, you have this with another political party called Action SA. But the point I'm trying to make is that it was not always that South Africa was accepted by everybody in the international system. Another example under Mandela was when Mandela went to the Commonwealth Summit and called out the Nigerian general who was in charge of Nigeria, head of Nigeria at the time, General Sani Abacha, for the human rights violations of the democratic activists in Nigeria. And that caused a lot of contestation and tensions between Mandela and his African peers. And I think Mbeki understood that and talked about partnership, inclusiveness through the African Renaissance. But this perception that South Africa had to use Africa as the pivot in its national interest also starts to lose momentum because there are other actors that have developed relationships with Africa. Africa has a developed increasing relationship with China, with India, with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with the Gulf states, including with the EU and including with the US. So this idea that South Africa is the bridge maker and its role is to act as an interlocker also gets challenged. If we come to the point where we are today in terms of trying to understand the rules-based system to the power-based system of the international order, I think that's where South Africa's foreign national interest grapples. It grapples with how to articulate that understanding. So the defense of your foreign policy right now is we want to be independent. We are an independent sovereign state. We can choose who we want to do, who we want to engage with and who we want to talk to. We will not be dictated to because you don't like us to speak to Russia, but we will want to speak to Russia. And our foreign minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, has constantly raised this question of double standards in the international system and calls out the international community, particularly those actors who remain muted on other conflicts in the world, like the Palestine issue, or including the question about Western Sahara, which has been key issues in our foreign policy.